Hi, everyone, and thank you for being with us. And I want to thank especially Dr. Reay for accepting our invitation for this talk, which I'm sure will be wonderful and enlightening. Cultures of the Future is an initiative of the Research Center CETAPS, Center for English Translation and Anglo-Portuguese Studies, and aims to be an online forum to discuss key issues for the advancement of humanities and the study of culture at large, and to provide innovative tools and methods for research by inviting prominent scholars from all over the world to reflect on relevant topics to our fields of research. And also you can find our previous sessions on CETAP's YouTube channel. So Dr. Emma, it really is a pleasure to have you here with a talk titled The Child in Video Games, From the Meek to the Mighty to the Monstrous. So Dr. Emma is a senior lecturer in emerging media at University of Southampton, where she teaches the undergraduate degree in game design and art. Her recent research focuses on video games and mental health, gaming in childhood, the ethics of designing therapeutic video games, and play and bereavement. She's currently playing Baldur's Gate 3 and thinking a lot about cooperation, community, and ensemble storytelling. So, Dr. Emma, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Just bear with me while I share my screen. How's that looking, Jessica?
That's perfect.
Brilliant.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, well, thanks again. Thank you for that introduction. My name is Dr. Emma Reay. I am, as Jessica said, a senior lecturer in emerging media at the University of Southampton. That's a very long, wordy job title that's difficult to fit onto a poster, as we saw in the opening image. But it basically means I do video game research. Another thing I want to flag right at the beginning is that in 2 days' time, I'm going on maternity leave because I'm currently 37 weeks pregnant. I'm telling you this because, firstly, if I'm making you seasick by wibbling around, that's because I'm sat on a yoga ball. And secondly, if I suddenly pause dramatically mid-sentence, it's likely because I've just been kicked in the diaphragm. So I ask for your patience and grace in that. So thank you very much. All right, today I'm so excited to be sharing some research from my recently published book, The Child in Video Games. I'd just like to give a small content warning, which is the first few slides of this talk does include some swear words. So if there's anyone around you who might be sensitive to that, that's just a heads up. But apart from that, if you're ready, I'm ready. Let's get started. My avatar, Maxwell, hovers expectantly on his witch's broomstick, a befitting form of transport for this haunted mansion-themed level of the video game Scribblenauts Unlimited. I click on Maxwell's magic notebook, which opens as a yellow search bar, and flex my fingers above the keyboard. Pause. This is for research purposes, I remind myself. Exhale. I type in the word dildo, and it appears in a font designed to evoke the childly scrawling of a felt tip pen. I press enter. A list of 6 near homonyms expands to fill the screen. Cheery music jangles in the background as the game inquires whether I meant dilsk, dingo, diode, disco, dodo, or dad. I have no idea what a dilsk is, so I click on it, and something that looks like a green tiara appears on the screen. I open the notebook again, and this time I try vagina, which provides me with further learning opportunities. I add a valiha, a vaha, a vadigo, and a vagrant to my mise en scene. Cunt yields kang, which could be some kind of saddle. Booby and tit are both birds, and murder is a crow. Queer completes this avian assemblage with an exotic-looking yellow qualia. Arse delivers some really exciting results, including an eagle-headed horse, an alce, and an adzer, which I think is some kind of golf club. I choose an aki, which is quickly eaten by my vagrant. Butt plug rewards me with a bort, which looks like a tiny blue tooth. Whore produces something called a humi, which coincidentally looks like a butt plug. I continue to populate my digital collage with near homonyms of taboo nouns, humming along to the game's catchy theme tune. I don't want to type in any racist slurs, not least because I've already encountered some disturbing racialized stereotypes in this game, but I hazard the word fag, which has a dual meaning in British English. I get both a fae, F-A-Y, and a fae, F-A-E. The former is a small female fairy that I sit atop my alce, and the latter is a fabulous, semi-naked, winged, non-binary person with a coiffed fringe and lime green highlights. They proceed to kill my vagrant vagina and my smart-suited bespectacled aide, AIDS, who fails to defend himself despite having a sex, at his disposal. My dingo lollops past, holding the Valiha in his mouth like a stick. The Fae starts to attack Maxwell, so I'm forced to shoot them using my gun. I'm surprised that I'm allowed a gun. I shoot the Qualia too, and immediately regret it. So you might be wondering why. Why would I want to sully a sweet, sanitized playground like the one in Scribblenauts Unlimited? The answer is, I'm trying to break childhood. Or more specifically, I'm trying to violate the encoded boundaries of idealized childliness that scaffold this wholesome 2D puzzle game. And I'm failing. My efforts to introduce sex, slurs, and scatological language into this charming play space are thwarted at every turn by the game's wide-eyed innocence. Instead of rebuking me for my potty mouth, the game interprets my perversity as illiteracy. It doesn't scold me for my moral transgressions, but gently offers to correct my spelling. The game is patient, but unyielding, like a firm but fair primary school teacher dealing with a disobedient student. No matter what I try, I cannot shrug off the childlike subject position that has been assigned to me. I give up and accept that the final visualization of my stream of obscenities would look lovely pinned to the family fridge. For the past 6 years, I've been cataloguing representations of childhood in contemporary video games. I began this project because I believe that video games are key arenas in which definitions of childhood are being created and contested. And I've noticed that while child players of video games are lightning rods for academic attention, child characters in video games are mostly ignored. As a researcher working between the fields of game studies and children's literature studies, this bothered me. Feminist, queer, critical race, and critical disability scholars often analyze how specific identities are represented in video games. They point to fictional characters both as symptoms and as causes of misogyny, homophobia, racism, and ableism in gaming cultures. They also demonstrate that video game characters can be sites of resistance, either as figureheads for change or as statues to topple. Why then are debates about the impact of video games on childhood seemingly uninterested in digital depictions of children? Countless studies regard child players as if they were uniquely susceptible to the formative influences of interactive media. And yet there are so few projects documenting the scripts, symbols, and social norms that comprise their digital counterparts. In my book, I examine how children, childhood, and intergenerational relationships are depicted in contemporary video games. And I ask, how do these representations uphold or challenge contemporary Western constructions of the figure of the child? When Carl Jung traced the pervasive presence of the child archetype across myths, religion, folklore, and literature, he stressed that its transcultural and transhistorical role in the collective psyche could not be denied, explained away, or moved past. The most we can do, he wrote, is to dream the myth onward and give it a modern dress. My book dreams the myth of the child onward by examining the virtual children that populate digital game worlds. The shift in focus from the lived experiences of child players to the construction of child characters is not an abandonment of real children, not least because, as Robin Bernstein puts it, the idea that one can firmly and definitively separate imagined children from real children belies the, quote, simultaneity and mutual constitution of children and childhood, end quote. If childhood is, as Bernstein proposes, the embodied performance of a set of social scripts, then my intention is to read those scripts as they currently appear in video games. In doing so, my book complements the findings of children's media scholars such as Marsha Kinder, James G., David Buckingham, Jackie Marth, Seth Giddings, and Sarah Grimes. However, unlike these researchers, I have not specifically sought out the perspectives of child players, nor do I claim to represent their views. This isn't because I think children's opinions of the media that they consume and co-create are irrelevant, the opposite is true. I have run participatory research groups with young people about their contributions to gaming cultures, and I believe in the importance of this work. But I also think that in order to understand how video games shape children's self-concept and delineate the normative modes of behavior available to them, we need a comprehensive taxonomy of the tropes, stereotypes, and symbols that habituate players of all ages to certain figural imaginings of childhood. My book, therefore, provides additional frameworks for audience reception studies of child players by identifying and critiquing depictions of childhood that recur across a large corpus of video games. Once we have an overview of how video games present childhood as a conceptual category and as a conventional sign, we're in a better position to contextualize how young players submit to, collude in, or subvert the social roles made available to them through media representation. Equally, we can have more productive conversations about how adult players calibrate their own age-based identities and behaviors in response to portrayals of childhood in video games. I'm going to have a sip of my tea before it gets cold. So, to make sense of the scholarly neglect of child characters in video games, there are two factors to consider. Firstly, in popular consciousness, childhood is usually thought of as a straightforward biological reality, rather than as a politically contentious social status. While we are getting better at understanding gender, race, ability, and sexuality as relational identities that result from the interaction between biological and social factors, age is still generally considered a natural, essential, universal, and ahistorical identity marker. Despite the fact that the attitudes, ideals, and rituals surrounding the anatomical markers of youth vary dramatically across cultures and time periods, and even within cultures, common sense understandings of childhood see it as a self-evident state determined by objective measures, such as stages of physiological development or a person's age in years. Outside of children's literature studies, childhood studies, age studies, and girlhood studies, intersectional analyses of media representation tend to elide the ideological function of the adult-child binary. Of the disciplines that do approach childhood as a contested, shifting social construct, children's literature studies in particular has developed extensive critical apparatuses for interrogating representations of childhood that are presented to young people through the fiction they consume. In fact, the term atonormativity, which I'll spell because it's not obvious, it's A-E-T-O, atonormativity, which is the assumption that adult experiences and worldviews are normative, while those of children, and also the elderly, are deviant. That term originates in children's literature studies. Unfortunately, children's literature studies is not on speaking terms with game studies. This leads me to the second obstacle. Game studies has claimed legitimacy as an academic discipline by insisting on the incipient maturity of its medium, while children's literature studies have asserted that its academic contributions are either serious or utilitarian. We're not childish, game studies exclaims. We're not playing around, children's literature studies retorts. Both positions are being challenged by new researchers entering the fields, but developmentalist, atonormative rhetoric persists in game studies, and children's literature studies continues to approach video games with either bemused squeamishness or jealous suspicion. Before anybody gets upset about that previous statement, I want to make clear that I'm speaking from extensive first-hand experience. I have tried to stand with one foot in game studies and the other in children's literature studies for my entire academic career. And so I've seen from both sides the circular and self-flagellating arguments against the childishness of games and the frivolity of children's literature. Yes, there are video games that are decidedly grown up. And yes, there are children's books that are utterly profound. But to reject the child and to disavow levity is to acquiesce to the same system of values that is used to exclude both disciplines from mainstream academic inquiry. In all honesty, the fraught relationship between the child and the video game has made it difficult for me to maintain my academic dual citizenship as a children's literature scholar and as a game studies scholar. In fact, at the moment, I would say that I have extricated myself from children's literature scholarship, and I'm trying to get cozy and comfy within games scholarship. This is despite my unwavering belief that an interdisciplinary embrace would transform both fields for the better. Nonetheless, my attempts to integrate children's literature studies and game studies have thus far been about as successful as my attempts to integrate swear words into Scribblenauts Unlimited. Although there is exciting new scholarship on the horizon, the interdisciplinary waters surrounding the island of children's literature studies remain choppy, and researchers interested in pursuing video game research are still being told implicitly and explicitly not to rock the boat. I'm a bit more sympathetic towards game studies' lack of interest in or total disavowal of the figure of the child than I am towards children's literature studies' reluctance to accept video games. Children's literature studies should know better than to ignore or dismiss a body of text because they've been infantilized or trivialized, obviously. But there are fewer reasons why game studies scholars would view the child as anything other than an annoying, unfair encumbrance. Ananthropy provides a concise and representative example of game scholars' vexation with the imagined entanglement of gaming in childhood. She writes, "Newscasters are fond of reporting that video games are dangerous to children, either because they teach children how to steal cars and kill cops, or because they actually connect children electronically to the game-playing predators who are waiting to snatch them away. Religious leaders have wasted no time condemning video games as a trap for children's souls, and armchair psychologists accuse them of turning kids into antisocial hermits." James Newman comments that the impact that this has had on the academic study of games, noting, "Video games are seen as being a children's medium. This means that they are easily and readily denigrated as trivial, something that will be grown out of, demanding no further investigation." Christopher Paul similarly identifies the belief that video games are kids' toys as being one of the key elements of the rhetorical environment surrounding the medium that prevents it from attaining artistic legitimacy. When Chris Bateman gripes, "The exclusion of games from the category of art reflects the natural reluctance to let the kids eat at the grown-ups table," he exemplifies the kind of defensive exasperation that characterizes most game scholars' response to the yoking of video games and children. Samantha Blackman reflects on the internalization of the infantilization of video games, writing, "I find it telling that as an academic who's been studying video games for almost 2 decades and who has been playing video games for more than 4, I still find myself the victim of a mindset that video games are the stuff of child's play." Kishonna Gray highlights a further implication of the infantilization of video games, writing, "The dominant framing that gaming is child's play or not a serious entity to examine suggests that the violence occurring therein is acceptable." This is corroborated by Anita Sarkeesian, a feminist cultural critic who was one of the targets of the sexist harassment campaign known as Gamergate. In a reflective interview, Sarkeesian challenges the use of the word troll to describe online misogynists, noting that, quote, "It feels too childish. This is harassment and abuse." Likewise, in Sarkeesian's TEDx talk on the topic, she stresses that the majority of the perpetrators were adults, preempting Gamergate skeptics who might seek to downplay questions of liability and accountability by grouping gamers and children. This chorus of perspectives, aggregated here on this slide, spans more than a decade. It suggests that there is a continuing sense within game studies that unless the field can shield itself from accusations of childishness, video games will never be considered valid objects of study. The developmentalist rhetoric of maturation pervades in meta-analyses of the field too. Espen Arsa's introduction to volume 15 of the journal Game Studies warns that, quote, "If game studies, no longer the cute little baby it once may have been, is to succeed qualitatively and not just as a popular but ill-respected interdiscipline, the teenager needs to grow up and learn how to be self-critical," end quote. Ian Bogost also uses atonormative language to admonish the field. He compares the story-driven indie game Gone Home to young adult fiction, and continues that this is hardly anything to be ashamed of, but maybe nothing to praise either. If the ultimate bar for meaning in games is set at teen fare, then perhaps video games will remain stuck in a perpetual adolescence, even if they escape the stereotypical dude bros basement. Other paths are possible, and perhaps the most promising ones will bypass rather than resolve games' youthful indiscretions. Burgos adopts the language of video game denigrators to endorse a linear view of progression, wherein the passage of time leads game design on a unidirectional path towards the pinnacle of adulthood. His desire to disown the early years of game development, which he characterizes as a period of embarrassing infantile ineptitude, is connected to his desire for video games to transcend low culture, for which YA fiction is a metonym. This makes sense in light of Henry Jenkins's observation that the figure of the child, quote, exists outside the culture, precisely so we can use it to regulate cultural hierarchies, to separate the impure influence of popular culture from the sanctifying touch of high culture, end quote. However, Burgos' reliance on the fact that childish is always an insult, even when directed at children, and that maturity can sound like a politically neutral, universally accessible quality, allows him to keep his vision for the future of video games rather vague. I should note here that Gone Home, the game that Burgos finds so underwhelming, is a non-violent, gothic, domestic, character-driven walking simulator with a queer female protagonist. The charge of childishness does a lot of obfuscatory work to mask critiques that could otherwise be read as sexist or homophobic. In any case, shifting the dividing line between grown-up and childish a few degrees in one direction or the other is not an effective strategy for addressing high culture's conceptually parasitic relationship to low culture. In contrast, a truly disruptive act would be to embrace childishness, arrested development, and growing sideways, as Catherine Bond Stockton would put it. Queer theorist Jack Halberstam, for example, chooses to illustrate his philosophical arguments using examples drawn from popular children's films and TV shows, most commonly from SpongeBob SquarePants, if you're wondering. He makes this choice not in spite of their limited cultural credibility, but because of it. In making an ally of the child, he signals his rejection of conventional value hierarchies within academia and his reluctance to uncritically reproduce any of its boundaries. It is no coincidence that critics who lean into the connection between gaming and childhood often use frameworks drawn from queer theory. This is a defiant response to the weaponization of the symbol of the child against queer communities. See Lee Edelman and everyone who came after him. And it provides an instructive precedent for game studies. Taking seriously the connection between gaming and childhood can, perhaps counterintuitively, make it harder to trivialize systemic violence in gaming culture. Game scholars are right to be skeptical of studies rooted in media effects determinism that claim video games make children violent, or obese, or hyperactive, or reclusive, or whatever else. But, as Kali Kakurek has argued, denying the formative effects of video games on players of all ages prevents us from adequately challenging the militarized, white supremacist, misogynistic schema that aligns certain video games with racist, anti-feminist, homophobic, fascist movements. As rule-based structures, games are powerful tools for disciplining players into accepting certain social roles and performing certain behaviors. And gamers are being actively recruited into nationalistic, alt-right political crusades. You can look at the work of Rachel Cowart from 2022 and 2023 for more on that. Inviting the figure of the child into game studies signals the field's readiness to tackle issues relating to social impact, ethical design, and accountability. Furthermore, an intentional focus on child characters gives game studies scholars the opportunity to reflect on the moral currency of childhood as it pertains to white innocence, consumer conditioning, and the twisted Bildungsroman logic of red pilling that is sometimes evoked to explain certain gamer identities. In an age in which our time is often valued in terms of utility and productivity, there is something radical inherent in any form of autotelic play, such that when video game detractors dismiss the medium as a waste of time, they inadvertently point to its countercultural power. I think this transgressive potential is closely tied to the ways in which video games can destabilize age-based identities. Specifically, I believe that when video games facilitate paideia, or playing like a child, they break adulthood, just as much as video games that facilitate violent play supposedly break childhood. Jean Baudrillard argues that the function of Disneyland as a psychic space for adult Americans is to license and sell paideia, while circumscribing this reenchantment within the confines of its parks and characterizing it strictly as a consumer activity. This confinement renders adult paideia in other contexts out of place, shameful, and even pathological. The maintenance of the status quo requires the stymieing of what-if play in adulthood, because this mode of being can prime us for social adaptation and for the renegotiation of interpersonal and institutional rules. As game studies scholar Graham Kirkpatrick puts it, imaginative play has the, quote, ability to make people think in ways that take them beyond the current ordering of the sensible, thereby revealing the deep contingency of current arrangements and creating an opening onto different ways of living, end quote. Games philosopher Miguel Sicart is even more blunt, writing, quote, play appropriates events, structures, and institutions to mock them and trivialize them. Sicart suggests that mimetic play, a form of paidic play, can be a form of carnivalesque mimicry, which contaminates the real-world referent with play's fictionality, thereby undermining its stability, gravity, and veracity. Video game play in particular tests the barrier between reality and fiction by virtue of being half real, as Jesper Juul would put it. Building on Juul's framing of the relationship between the real rules of digital games and the fictional worlds that act as their interfaces, Timothy Welsh concludes, quote, the real event of video gaming ripples across multiple interwoven contexts, physical, social, virtual, end quote. Video games blur the line between public play and private play, as well as players' consumption and players' creation. But most significantly, they blur the line between the immateriality of fantasy and the materiality of performance by inviting players to take action. Christopher T. Nguyen sees games as, quote, libraries of agencies in which we may discover and familiarize ourselves with new modes of agency, end quote. He argues that while painting lets us record sights and music lets us record sound, games let us inscribe agency, and the inscription process itself makes it easier to understand different experiences of agency and autonomy. He emphasizes that games don't simply describe the outlines of agency, they encourage players to act, allowing them to understand alternate agencies from the inside. The identities of adult and child are contingent on collective definitions of agency, ability, competence, responsibility, and autonomy, whatever other synonym you want to put in there. Therefore, as libraries of agencies, video games provide us with possibility spaces within which we might think flexibly about the changing roles, rights, and prohibitions that are conditionally doled out and rescinded along the timeline of our lives. What I'm trying to say is that it's not a coincidence that age-based ideologies are the spanking paddle of choice for the cultural hazing of video games. If video games can both prematurely curtail childhood by corrupting innocent children and unnaturally prolong childhood by enabling adult regression, then it follows that the medium poses a real threat to the age-based stratification of society. Viewed this way, it seems the reactionaries are right. Video games are ruining childhood, and by extension, they're destroying its conceptual foil, adulthood. Drink. If we contextualize the moral panic surrounding children's relationship with video games within a longer history of anxiety about innovations in communications technology, we can see that new tools for creative expression have reliably precipitated societal upheaval, the redistribution of power, and the reimagining of social roles. In the 1980s, Neil Postman famously argued that childhood was disappearing. Everywhere one looks, he writes, it may be seen that the behavior, language, attitudes, and desires, even the physical appearance of adults and children are becoming increasingly indistinguishable, end quote. Postman credits the printing press with the invention of childhood, claiming that illiteracy expelled children from the adult world, thereby forcing into existence a separate symbolic realm that young people could inhabit. And he blames the television, which apparently hails children and adults as equals, for childhood's end. I'm not going to speculate today about whether video games represent childhood's death throes or its resurrection. However, my hunch is that while the children's revolution won't be televised, it might be live streamed on Twitch. The implications of destabilizing age-based identities are wide-reaching. Since chronological age is an index for political participation and an instrument for regulating gender, class, and racial hierarchies, virtual spaces in which age is not a key organizing rubric, i.e., where children and adults can play together as equals without age stratifying or segregating them, these spaces have the potential to trouble hegemonic power. Imagining alternate worlds in which children are differently integrated into Western society could, for example, change labor conditions that are currently deemed acceptable, decrease the value placed on independence and individualism, undo the atomizing effect of the nuclear family on communities, transform urban planning and the design of public spaces, reframe thinking around disability and access, undermine neo-colonial attitudes towards so-called developing countries, and form new networks of nurture. Rather than passively waiting to grow up, it is time for game studies to run towards the trouble rather than away from it, to borrow Amanda Phillips's expression. The anxious, angry rhetoric of video game detractors tells us where and how video games matter, and all routes pass through the child. The material turn in cultural studies means that the spotlight has shone on child players, but child characters have remained in the wings. Children's literature studies has the relevant critical apparatuses to theorize fictional childhoods, but these approaches will not stay relevant unless we can apply them to video games, the medium which will be memorialized as the defining art form of the 21st century. For these reasons alone, I think that building a bridge between children's literature studies and game studies is a worthwhile venture, and I hope that it justifies the existence of my book, which is what I've tried to do in today's presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Emma. That was absolutely wonderful, and well, it's very necessary, especially when there's still so much stigma around video games and the study of games in academia. So I think we can wrap up, and I want to thank Dr. Emma, obviously, for being here for this incredible lecture and this incredible session. So thank you so much, Dr. Emma. It was amazing.
Thank you so much for
thank you all
having
for
me.
being here.